How does the world's strongest military get stopped by rebels in old trucks? We are told a story of heroes and bad luck. We are told it was just a rescue mission gone wrong. But what if that is a lie? What if the mission was doomed before it even started? Most people think the battle failed because two Black Hawk helicopters were shot down. They think a lucky shot changed history. That is wrong. The truth is much more chilling. The battle stalled because of a deadly mix of political ego and a total failure to understand the streets. On October 3, 1993, elite U.S. Rangers and Delta Force operators dropped into the heart of Mogadishu. They were the best of the best. They had the best tech, the best training, and the best weapons. They expected a quick hit. They thought they would be in and out in an hour. They were wrong. The air was thick with dust and the smell of burning tires. The U.S. thought they were invisible because they had satellites in space. But on the ground, the Somali militia was using a human web to watch every single move. While the Americans waited for orders to travel through thousands of miles of wires back to Washington, the rebels were using simple signals to trap them. The trap was set. The moment the first bird hit the ground, the myth of American invincibility shattered. This was not just a fight. It was a wake-up call that the world was changing. High-tech sensors do not matter when you are pinned down in a maze of narrow alleys. In this video, we are peeling back the Hollywood paint. We are looking at the cold reality of a disaster. You are going to see how a mission to feed starving people turned into a bloody manhunt. You will see why the commanders in charge were left begging for tanks that never came. This is the real story of why the Battle of Mogadishu stalled. This is the moment the United States lost its appetite for war for an entire generation. Get ready. Because the history books left out the most important part. We are going back to the Baccarat market to find out what really happened when the world's only superpower started to bleed. This is not the movie version. This is the truth. To understand why this mission ground to a halt, we have to look at the first big reason, the intelligence blackout. This was a battle between a high-tech giant and a low-tech ghost. Imagine you are a commander in a high-tech command center. You have screens showing live video from spy planes. You have radios that can talk to the Pentagon. You feel like a god who can see everything. But in the streets of Mogadishu, that vision was a total illusion. The U.S. military relied on a top-down view. They looked at the city like a map. But the Somali militia leader, Mohammed Farah Aidid, looked at the city like a living organism. He didn't have satellites. He had people. Every time a U.S. helicopter started its engines at the airport, a Somali lookout with a 50 radio or a simple mirror would signal the city. Within seconds, the entire neighborhood knew the Americans were coming. They didn't need encrypted codes. They used the smoke from burning tires to tell their fighters exactly where to go. While the U.S. was waiting for high-resolution photos to be processed, the Somali rebels were already moving into position. This created a massive lag time. Think about playing a video game where your controller takes 3 seconds to respond to your buttons. You would lose every time. That is exactly what happened in the Bikara market. The U.S. troops on the ground had to ask for permission for almost everything. Their requests went up to the spy plane, then to the command center, and sometimes all the way back to the United States. By the time the answer came back, the situation on the street had already changed. The enemy was no longer where the map said they were. The stall started in the mind before it ever started in the streets. Now, let's answer the question everyone asks: why weren't there any tanks? This is where the political handcuffs come in. Usually, when you send elite soldiers into a hostile city, you bring heavy armor. You bring tanks that can smash through barricades. You bring armored vehicles that can stop bullets. The commanders on the ground, like Major General William Garrison, knew this. They begged Washington for M1 Abrams tanks and armored personnel carriers. They even asked for AC-130 gunships, huge planes that can rain down fire with pinpoint accuracy. But the answer from the politicians in Washington was a cold no. Why? Because they were worried about optics. In the world of politics, optics is how things look on the news. The leaders in the U.S. government were afraid that if the world saw American tanks rolling through the streets of a poor African city, it would look like an invasion instead of a humanitarian mission. They wanted the mission to look soft. They wanted it to look like a quick police action. So, they sent the Rangers in thin-skinned Humvees. They sent them in helicopters that had no armor on the bottom. This was a fatal mistake. Without tanks, the U.S. convoys were just sitting ducks. A Humvee is great for driving on a highway, but in a narrow alley filled with thousands of angry people, it is a metal coffin. When the first Black Hawk went down, the ground convoy tried to reach the crash site. But they couldn't just drive through the walls or push cars out of the way. Every time they turned a corner, they hit a wall of fire. They were stopped by piles of trash and old car frames. If they had tanks, they could have reached the crash site in minutes. Instead, they spent hours stuck in kill zones, taking fire from every window and every rooftop. The mission had also suffered from something called mission creep. This is a dangerous trap where a simple goal slowly turns into a giant, complicated mess. At first, the U.S. was only in Somalia to make sure food got to starving people. It was a beautiful, noble goal. But slowly, the goal changed. It became about nation building. Then it became about arresting aided. The soldiers were still equipped for a food mission, but they were being asked to fight a war. This is the exact point where the gear didn't match the job. You wouldn't go to a professional football game wearing a swimsuit, right? But that is essentially what the U.S. did. They went into a high-intensity urban combat zone with equipment meant for a low-level patrol. The politicians were trying to fight a clean war that wouldn't look bad on TV. But war is never clean. By trying to avoid looking like an invading army, they guaranteed that the mission would stall. They stripped the soldiers of their shield and then wondered why they were getting hit. As the sun began to set over Mogadishu, the reality set in. The most elite force in the world was pinned down. They were trapped in a city that had turned into a giant maze. The high-tech radios were buzzing with static and confused reports. That quick 1-hour mission had turned into a nightmare that was only just beginning. The convoy was not moving. The helicopters were on the ground. And the world was about to watch a superpower struggle to survive in a place they thought they already controlled. This wasn't just a tactical failure, it was a total breakdown of the system. And the cost of that breakdown was about to be paid in blood. As the darkness swallowed the city, the battle entered its most terrifying phase. The U.S. troops were no longer just on a mission, they were fighting for their lives in a place that had become a literal furnace of fire. This is where we see the physical mechanics of the stall. Most people think a battle is about who has the most bullets. But in the narrow, winding streets of the Bukhara market, the battle was actually about who controlled the space. The Somali militia understood something the U.S. commanders had overlooked: technology is a weakness if you don't have the room to use it. The primary weapon used to stall the American giant was the RPG-7. Now, on paper, an RPG is a primitive weapon. It is a shoulder-fired rocket that is usually used against tanks. But the Somali fighters had developed a clever, deadly tactic. They knew they couldn't aim perfectly at a moving helicopter. Instead, they used volume fire. They would have dozens of fighters point their rockets at the same spot in the sky where a Black Hawk was hovering. They would all fire at once, creating a wall of explosions. They weren't aiming for the body of the helicopter, they were aiming for the tail rotor. It only takes one small piece of metal to break a tail rotor, and once that happens, the most advanced aircraft in the world becomes a spinning rock. Once those helicopters were on the ground, the entire mission changed. The U.S. military has a sacred rule: leave no man behind. This is a noble rule, but the Somali militia used it as a trap. They knew that if they crashed a helicopter, the Americans would stop everything to save the survivors. The militia didn't have to chase the Rangers anymore, they just had to wait at the crash sites. The U.S. ground convoys became paralyzed. They couldn't move forward to capture their targets, and they couldn't move backward to safety. They were stuck in a kill zone, moving a few inches at a time while being attacked from 360 degrees. The communication on the ground also started to fall apart. This is a huge reason why the convoy stalled. Imagine being a driver in a Humvee. You are surrounded by smoke, dust, and the deafening sound of gunfire. You can't see the street signs. You can't see the enemy. You are waiting for the eyes in the sky to tell you which way to turn. But there was a delay. The spy planes high above would see a roadblock and tell the command center. The command center would then tell the convoy. But by the time the message got to the driver, he had already turned the corner and driven right into an ambush. The convoy was literally driving in circles, getting shredded by gunfire because the information was moving too slowly. By the early hours of the morning, the situation was desperate. The elite soldiers were pinned down in a series of crumbling buildings. They were running low on water. They were running low on ammunition. And they were surrounded by thousands of armed militia members. This was the ultimate stall. The most powerful nation on earth was being held at bay by a city that refused to give up. The U.S. finally had to do what the politicians had feared most: they had to ask for help from other countries. They had to bring in Pakistani tanks and Malaysian armored vehicles to break the stalemate. This was a massive blow to American pride. It proved that the light and fast plan was a total failure. The final act of this tragedy is known as the Mogadishu Mile. Because there wasn't enough room in the armored vehicles for everyone, many of the Rangers and Delta operators had to run out of the city on foot. They ran through the streets while being shot at, using the vehicles as shields. They were exhausted, wounded, and emotionally drained. They had won the tactical fight, they had captured the people they went in for, but they had lost the battle for the city. When they finally reached the safety of the stadium, the stall was over, but the damage was done. The legacy of this battle changed everything. It created what historians call the Somalia Syndrome. 4 years after this, the United States was terrified of getting involved in foreign conflicts. When the genocide happened in Rwanda just a year later, the U.S. stayed away because they were still haunted by the images of Mogadishu. They were afraid of another mission stalling. They were afraid of more soldiers being dragged through the streets on the evening news. The Battle of Mogadishu stalled because the U.S. tried to fight a clean, high-tech war in a messy, low-tech world. They underestimated their enemy and overtrusted their machines. They let politics dictate their equipment and let optics get in the way of safety. The brave men on the ground did everything they could, but they were fighting a system that had already failed them. As we look back at the dust of the Bukhara market, we have to remember, power isn't just about having the biggest guns. It's about understanding the ground you are standing on. If you don't respect the environment, even the mightiest empire can be brought to a halt by a pile of burning tires and a 50 radio. In the aftermath of the Mogadishu Mile, the smoke cleared to reveal a political and military landscape that had been changed forever. To truly understand why the battle stalled, we have to look at the final, most painful reason, the gap between tactical victory and strategic defeat. On paper, the mission was actually a success. The Rangers and Delta Force operators had captured the 2 high-level targets they went in for. But in the eyes of the world, and in the heart of the American public, it was a disaster. This is the strategic stall. It is when you win the fight but lose the will to keep going. When the sun came up on October 4th, the images hitting the television screens back in the United States were horrifying. Because the mission had stalled in the streets, the enemy had time to gather their cameras. The world saw American soldiers being treated with disrespect in the streets of Mogadishu. For a public that had been told this was a simple mission to feed the hungry, this was a massive shock. The optics that the politicians in Washington were so afraid of had become a reality, but in the worst way possible. Within days, the pressure to leave Somalia became so loud that the government had no choice but to listen. This battle created a ghost that would haunt the U.S. military for decades. It was called the zero-casualty mindset. Because the mission in Mogadishu stalled and turned bloody, leaders became terrified of any risk. They started to believe that the American public would never support a war if even one soldier was lost. This fear led to a total paralysis in foreign policy. Just months later, when hundreds of thousands of people were in danger in Rwanda, the U.S. chose to stay on the sidelines. They were so afraid of another Mogadishu that they watched from afar while a tragedy unfolded. The stall in that small African market had grown into a stall of American leadership across the entire globe. But what can we learn from this as students of tactical history? The biggest lesson is about the human element. You can have the best night vision goggles, the fastest helicopters, and the most accurate rifles, but if you do not understand the culture and the people on the ground, your tech will fail you. The Somali militia didn't need a billion-dollar budget to stop a superpower. They just needed to understand the streets better than the Americans did. They turned the city's weaknesses, the narrow alleys, the trash, the crowded buildings, into their greatest strengths. They fought a total war where everyone was a scout and every rooftop was a fortress. The Battle of Mogadishu stalled because of a failure of imagination. The leaders in Washington couldn't imagine a low-tech enemy fighting back that hard. The commanders couldn't imagine their high-tech communication failing. And the soldiers were left to pay the price for those failures. It is a reminder that in war, the plan is only as good as its ability to survive the first 5 minutes of contact. When you strip away the armor to look nice for the cameras, and when you ignore the warnings of the men on the ground, you aren't just making a mistake, you are setting a trap for your own people. Today, military students still study these 15 hours of chaos. They look at the maps of the Bukhara market and try to figure out how they would have done it differently. They talk about the 3-block war, where a soldier might be handing out food on one block, keeping peace on the next, and fighting for his life on the third. Mogadishu was the first time the modern world saw how complicated and messy urban fighting really is. It showed that there is no such thing as a quick and easy mission when you are fighting in someone else's home. As we end this deep dive, remember the men who were there. While the plan stalled, their courage never did. They fought through a nightmare that was created by people sitting in air-conditioned offices thousands of miles away. The Battle of Mogadishu wasn't a failure of bravery, it was a failure of the system. It remains a powerful warning for any nation that thinks technology can replace strategy, or that optics are more important than armor. The dust has settled in Somalia, but the lessons of that day are still being whispered in the halls of the Pentagon. The next time you see a movie about this battle, look past the explosions. Think about the radios that didn't work. Think about the tanks that weren't there. And think about the mission creep that turned a help mission into a heartbeat-stopping tragedy. Because if we don't learn why the battle stalled back then, we are destined to see it happen all over again. Thank you for walking through this tactical history with me. The truth is often harder to hear than the legend, but it is the only thing that helps us move forward. In the years following the withdrawal from Somalia, the lessons of the Bukhara market became the foundation for a new way of thinking about combat. We have to look at the technical aftermath. This is the part of the story most people skip, but it is the most important. The stall in Mogadishu forced the U.S. military to realize that their equipment was built for a different world. They were prepared for a massive tank battle in Europe, not a street fight in a crowded city. This failure changed the very gear that soldiers wear today. Before 1993, the idea of urban warfare was something the military tried to avoid. But after the battle stalled, they realized they had to master it. This led to the creation of better body armor and more modular weapons. They realized that in a city, a long rifle is a burden, and a thin vest is a death sentence. The military also started pouring money into real-time intelligence. They saw how the 20-minute delay in communication killed people in Mogadishu. Today, a soldier on the ground can see a live video feed from a drone right on their handheld device. They have solved the information stall, but the cost to get there was nearly 20 elite lives. Another huge shift was in combat medicine. During the Battle of Mogadishu, many of the casualties happened because medics couldn't reach the wounded in time, or they didn't have the right tools to stop heavy bleeding in the field. The stall meant that soldiers had to act as their own doctors for hours while pinned down. This led to the development of better tourniquets and blood-clotting bandages that every soldier carries now. It is a bittersweet reality. The pain of that night in 1993 has saved thousands of lives in Iraq and Afghanistan. The mission stalled, but the medical progress jumped forward. However, we must also look at the psychological stall left on the Somali people. While we often focus on the U.S. side, the city of Mogadishu was left with deep scars. The battle proved that a local militia could stand up to a superpower, but it also left the country in a state of chaos that lasted for decades. Because the U.S. and the UN pulled out so quickly after the battle, that nation-building mission was abandoned. Somalia became a forgotten conflict for a long time. This shows us the true danger of a mission that stalls. When the powerful side leaves, the vacuum that remains is often filled by even more violence. The Battle of Mogadishu is a mirror. When we look into it, we see the best and worst of human planning. We see the incredible bravery of the Rangers and Delta operators who refused to give up on their friends. We see the tactical skill of a militia that used their home field advantage to perfection. But we also see the shadows of politicians who tried to win a war without getting their hands dirty. They wanted the glory of a successful mission without the bad press of the heavy equipment needed to win it. If there is one thing you take away from this video, let it be this: history is not just a list of dates and names. It is a series of choices. The choice to deny armor, the choice to change the mission goal, and the choice to ignore the warnings of the experts, all of these combined to create the stall. In the tactical world, there is no such thing as a small mistake. Every tiny oversight is magnified 1,000 times when the bullets start flying. Mogadishu taught us that if fast and light is a gamble. Sometimes you win, and you look like a genius. But when you lose big. The 1993 battle was the moment the gamble failed. It was the moment the world realized that even a giant can be tripped by a wire if he isn't looking at his feet. As we close this chapter of tactical history, look at the world around you. You will see the Somalia syndrome in every debate about foreign war. You will see the ghost of the Black Hawk in every new drone and every piece of armored glass. The battle stalled in the streets of Somalia, but it started a conversation that is still happening today in the halls of power. We must keep asking the hard questions. We must keep looking past the movies and the myths. Because the only way to honor the people who were there is to tell the truth about why it happened. Thanks for watching this deep dive into the mechanics of a disaster. If you want to see more tactical breakdowns of history's most turning point moments, make sure to stay tuned. The more we know about the failures of the past, the better we can prepare for the challenges of the future. The streets of Mogadishu are quiet now, but the lessons they taught us are louder than ever. Finally, we have to look at the legacy of the stall. This is the part of the story that still affects the world we live in today. When the last American soldier left the stadium in Mogadishu, the battle didn't really end. It just moved from the streets into the history books and the minds of military leaders. The 1993 mission changed the DNA of how countries think about intervention. 4 years afterward, if a crisis happened anywhere in the world, the first question politicians asked was, is this going to turn into another Somalia? This fear created a strategic stall for the entire decade of the 1990s. We see this most clearly in the tragedy of Rwanda. Just a few months after the Battle of Mogadishu, a massive wave of violence broke out in Rwanda. Hundreds of thousands of people were in danger. The world looked to the United States to help, but the memory of the Black Sea was too fresh. The U.S. government was so paralyzed by the fear of losing more soldiers in a senseless conflict that they did almost nothing. The stall in a few blocks of Mogadishu effectively prevented the rescue of an entire nation. This is the true, hidden cost of a failed mission. It takes away the courage to do the right thing the next time. But it wasn't just about politics. The U.S. military itself had to go through a massive tactical rebirth. They realized that their big army mindset was broken. They started focusing on urban operations as a specialized skill rather than an afterthought. They built entire fake cities in the middle of the desert to practice. They learned how to fight from house to house, how to clear rooms, and how to protect convoys in tight spaces. They developed non-lethal weapons, like tear gas and flashbangs to deal with crowded streets without accidentally hitting civilians. Every time you see a modern soldier using a short carbine rifle or wearing advanced urban camouflage, you are seeing a lesson that was learned at a very high price in Somalia. The technology stall was also addressed. In 1993, the radios were heavy, the maps were paper, and the eyes in the sky were disconnected from the boots on the ground. Today, the military uses what they call network-centric warfare. This is a fancy way of saying that everyone is connected. A pilot in a helicopter sees exactly what the soldier in the Humvee sees. The commander in Washington sees exactly what the medic on the corner sees. They have tried to remove the lag time that caused the convoys to drive in circles in 1993. They realized that in the modern world, information is just as important as ammunition. We also have to talk about the human cost that never goes away. The families of the 18 Americans who died that day, and the hundreds of Somali families who lost loved ones, carry the weight of that 15-hour stall every single day. For the soldiers who survived, the Mogadishu Mile isn't a movie scene, it's a memory of the smell of cordite and the sound of a city trying to kill them. When we study history, it's easy to get lost in the maps and the gear. But we must never forget that behind every tactical error was a human life. The stall wasn't just a delay in a mission, it was a permanent stop for many young men who never got to go home. As we conclude this video, look back at the title, Why the 1993 Battle of Mogadishu Stalled. It wasn't one thing. It was a chain of failures. It was a politician's fear of a bad image denying the soldiers the tanks they needed. It was a politician's fear of a bad image denying the soldiers the tanks they needed. It was a politician's fear of a bad image denying the soldiers the tanks they needed. It was a politician's fear of a bad image denying the soldiers the tanks they needed. It was a politician's fear of a bad image denying the soldiers the tanks they needed. It was a politician's fear of a bad image denying the soldiers the tanks they needed. It was a politician's fear of a bad image denying the soldiers the tanks they needed. It was a politician's fear of a bad image denying the soldiers the tanks they needed. It was a politician's fear of a bad image denying the soldiers the tanks they needed. It was a politician's fear of a bad image denying the soldiers the tanks they needed. It was a politician's fear of a bad image denying the soldiers the tanks they needed. It was a politician's fear of a bad image denying the soldiers the tanks they needed. It was a politician's fear of a bad image denying the soldiers the tanks they needed. It was a politician's fear of a bad image denying the soldiers the tanks they needed. It was a politician's fear of a bad image denying the soldiers the tanks they needed. It was a politician's fear of a bad image denying the soldiers the tanks they needed.